The dust-stained sun beat down mercilessly as Josephine Parker stumbled through the barren stretch of New Mexico territory, her feet leaving crimson imprints on the scorched earth beneath her. It was 1878, and she had just done the unthinkable. She had fled from the man who had promised before God to cherish her, but had instead made her existence a living hell. Blood trickled from her split lip as she pressed onward, each step sending shards of pain through her bruised body. The rocks and cacti tore at her bare feet, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. 3 years of marriage to Harold Bentley had taught her that some vows were chains disguised as promises. Tonight, when his drunken rage had turned more violent than ever before, she'd finally gathered the courage to flee while he lay in a whiskey-induced slumber. The vast, moonlit desert stretched endlessly before her. Josephine had no plan beyond escape, no destination beyond a way. Her light cotton dress, torn at the hem, offered little protection against the cool night air that had now given way to the relentless morning heat. The water from a small creek she'd stumbled upon an hour ago had refreshed her momentarily, but thirst was returning with a vengeance. As the sun climbed higher, Josephine's vision began to swim. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the hard-packed earth. The world tilted and spun as she fought to remain conscious. This was how she would die alone in the desert, at least free from Harold's fists. Perhaps it was a fair trade. The sound came first, the rhythmic thudding of hooves against dry ground. Then a shadow fell across her face, blocking the punishing sun. Through swollen eyes, she made out the silhouette of a man atop a chestnut stallion. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "don't take me back to him." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. He knelt beside her, and Josephine flinched instinctively, raising her arms to shield her face. But the blow never came. Instead, she felt something cool press against her lips, a canteen. Water trickled into her parched mouth, sweet as honey. The stranger's hand gently supported the back of her head, tilting it to help her drink without choking. When she had taken her fill, he set the canteen aside and reached into his saddlebag, producing clean bandages and a small tin of salve. Still, he had not spoken a single word. His movements were deliberate and careful as he examined her feet, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Josephine studied him through the haze of pain. He was young, perhaps 25, with sun-bronzed skin and a strong jaw dusted with stubble. His clothes were practical, worn denim, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and the unmistakable attire of a cowboy. A revolver hung at his hip, but something in his gentle touch told her she had nothing to fear from this man. He cleaned her wounded feet with water from his canteen, his touch clinical yet somehow tender. When he applied the salve to her cuts, she hissed in pain, and his eyes a striking hazel that reminded her of the prairie grass after a rain flicked up to meet hers apologetically. "Thank you," Josephine murmured, her voice still weak. He nodded once, then proceeded to wrap her feet in the clean bandages. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and finally spoke. "Quinn Hayes," he said simply, tipping his hat. His voice was deeper than she expected, with the slightest hint of a southern drawl. "I've got a cabin about an hour's ride from here. You need shelter and proper care for those injuries." Josephine tensed. The thought of being alone with a strange man filled her with dread, regardless of his apparent kindness. Quinn seemed to read her thoughts. "You'll be safe there, madam. You have my word, and when you're healed, I'll take you wherever you want to go." She hesitated, weighing her options, which were admittedly few. Stay here and certainly perish, or trust this quiet cowboy who had shown her nothing but gentleness so far. "Josephine," she finally replied. "Josephine Parker." She did not use her married name. That part of her life was over. Quinn nodded, helping her to her feet. The world spun again, and she swayed dangerously. Without a word, he swept her up into his arms and carried her to his horse. "Hold on tight," he instructed, settling her in the saddle before mounting behind her. one strong arm wrapped securely around her waist as he took the reins with his free hand. As they rode across the desert, Josephine leaned back against his chest, too exhausted to maintain her guard. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid presence of the cowboy behind her lulled her into a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. There was a long pause before Quinn answered, his breath warm against her ear. "Because everyone deserves kindness, Mrs. Parker, especially those who've seen so little of it." Josephine closed her eyes against sudden tears. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to hope. Quinn's cabin appeared on the horizon like a mirage, nestled against a backdrop of rust-colored cliffs. It was modest but well-built, with a small corral to one side where another horse, a dappled gray, grazed contentedly. A stream trickled nearby, feeding a small garden plot that sprouted hardy vegetables. "It's not much," Quinn said as they approached, "but it's home." To Josephine, who had spent the last 3 years in a squalid mining town shack where Harold would return each night with coal dust in his lungs and rage in his heart, Quinn's cabin looked like paradise. He dismounted first, then carefully lifted her down. Her bandaged feet barely touched the ground before he scooped her up again, carrying her to the cabin door. Inside, the single room was surprisingly neat and organized. A bed with a handmade quilt occupied one corner, a pot-bellied stove another. A table with 2 chairs sat beneath the room's single window, and shelves lined with provisions and books stretched across one wall. Quinn set her gently on the bed, then moved to stoke the fire in the stove. "You need rest and food," he said, his back to her as he worked. "I'll make some stew." Josephine sank into the soft mattress, her body suddenly reminding her of every bruise and ache. "I don't want to impose—" "You're not," he cut in firmly, turning to meet her gaze. "Stay as long as you need." There was something in his expression, a sorrow, perhaps, or an understanding that silenced her protests. This man knew something of pain himself, she realized. Perhaps that was why he had stopped to help her without hesitation. Quinn moved around the cabin with an easy efficiency, preparing a simple meal while Josephine drifted in and out of consciousness. The smell of cooking meat and herbs eventually roused her fully. "Can you eat?" he asked, approaching with a steaming bowl. Josephine nodded, struggling to sit up. Quinn set the bowl aside and helped her, arranging the pillow behind her back for support. Their faces came close as he leaned over her, and for a moment she caught the scent of leather and sage on his skin. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the bowl and spoon he offered. The stew was hearty and flavorful, warming her from the inside out. Quinn sat at the table, giving her space as she ate. He seemed content with the silence, his gaze fixed on the window, where the late afternoon sun painted the desert in gold and crimson. "How long have you lived out here?" Josephine asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. 2 years, he replied. "After the war, I couldn't stand being around too many people, needed the quiet." "The war? But you're so young." A shadow crossed his face. "Joined up at 16, lied about my age. Spent 4 years watching men die for causes most didn't understand." He shrugged, as if trying to dislodge the memory. "Been 9 years since Appomattox. Sometimes feels like yesterday." Josephine did the calculation in her head. That would make him around 29, older than she had initially guessed, but still young to be living such a solitary existence. "What about you?" Quinn asked, changing the subject. "Where were you headed?" Josephine stared down at her bowl. "Anywhere. Away." She took a deep breath. "My husband. He's not a kind man." Quinn nodded, asking no further questions. His acceptance of her sparse explanation was yet another kindness. "You're safe here," he said simply. "When you're stronger, we'll figure out where anywhere might be." That night, Quinn insisted she take the bed while he made a pallet on the floor near the stove. As darkness fell over the desert, Josephine lay awake, listening to the cowboy's steady breathing and the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear, knotting her stomach. The next morning, she woke to find Quinn already gone, a note on the table explaining he'd gone hunting and would return by midday. Beside the note sat a basin of fresh water, a bar of soap, and a bundle of clothing, a man's shirt and trousers that would be far too large for her, but clean nonetheless. Josephine washed as best she could, wincing as the water revealed the extent of her bruising, purple and yellow marks that mapped Harold's rage across her skin. She donned Quinn's offered clothes, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs and securing the waist with a length of rope she found hanging by the door. She tried to stand, testing her bandaged feet. The pain was still sharp, but bearable enough to hobble to the cabin door and step outside. The desert stretched before her, vibrant with morning light. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Josephine breathed deeply, savoring her freedom. A sound behind the cabin caught her attention. Limping carefully around the corner, she found Quinn's gray horse watching her with curious eyes. Josephine approached slowly, hand outstretched. "Hello there," she murmured as the horse snuffled at her palm. "Aren't you beautiful?" "Her name's Mercy." Josephine startled at Quinn's voice. He stood a few yards away, a brace of rabbits hanging from one hand, his rifle in the other. In the clear morning light, she got her first good look at her rescuer. Quinn Hayes was handsome in a weathered way, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he'd once smiled more often than he did now. His hair, revealed as he removed his hat, was a dark brown with strands of copper that caught the sunlight. "She suits her name," Josephine said, turning back to the horse. "Found her half dead in a canyon during a flash flood 2 springs ago," Quinn explained, moving to hang the rabbits from a post near the cabin. "Nursed her back to health. Now she follows me around like a dog." Josephine stroked Mercy's velvety nose. "You seem to make a habit of rescuing strays." Quinn glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Guess I do." He nodded toward her feet. "You shouldn't be walking on those yet." "They feel better today," she lied, ignoring the throbbing pain. Quinn's raised eyebrow told her he wasn't fooled. "Let me check them after I dress these rabbits. Then we'll talk about what comes next." What came next? The word sent a chill through Josephine despite the warming day. Where would she go? She had no family, no friends who weren't also acquaintances of Harold's. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back. Quinn must have noticed her distress. "No rush," he added. "You can stay here until you figure things out." The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm. Quinn would rise before dawn, tend to his horses and small garden, hunt if necessary, then return to check on Josephine's healing feet and prepare meals. Josephine, initially too weak to do much, gradually began to help around the cabin washing dishes, mending Quinn's spare shirt, reading aloud from one of his books while he worked outside. They spoke little at first, both guarded in their own ways, but as the days passed, the silence between them grew comfortable, and then companionable. A week after her arrival, Josephine found herself sitting on a bench Quinn had positioned outside the cabin, her healing feet soaking in a basin of cool water from the stream. The evening was mild, the sunset painting the desert in hues of amber and rose. Quinn emerged from the cabin, 2 steaming cups in his hands. He offered one to Josephine. "It's coffee," he said, "with a touch of honey. Thought you might like it." She accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Thank you. For everything." Quinn settled beside her on the bench, his larger frame dwarfing hers. "You don't need to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do," she insisted. "You saved my life, Quinn. You gave me shelter, asked for nothing in return." He sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Any decent man would have done the same. "No," Josephine said softly. "They wouldn't. Decency is rarer than you think." Quinn turned to look at her then, his hazel eyes searching her face. "What happened to you, Josephine? What are you running from?" The question hung in the air between them. Josephine stared down into her coffee, watching the steam curl and disappear into the evening air. She had not spoken of Harold to anyone, had hidden her bruises, and made excuses for her husband's absences from social gatherings. But here, with this quiet cowboy who had shown her nothing but kindness, The truth wanted to spill from her lips. "I married Harold Bentley when I was 18, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He courted me properly, spoke sweetly, promised me the world. My parents had just died of fever, and I was alone. He seemed like salvation." She took a shaky breath. "The first time he hit me was 2 weeks after our wedding. I'd burned his supper. He apologized afterward, wept, swore it would never happen again." A bitter laugh escaped her. But it did. Again and again. Each time worse than the last. Quinn's hand tightened around his cup, his knuckles white. "Where is he now?" "In Willow Creek, a mining town about 3 days' ride from where you found me." Josephine's voice hardened. "He works in the coal mines, drinks away most of his pay. I managed a small garden, took in laundry to make ends meet. It was never enough to please him." "Why did you leave now, after 3 years?" Josephine's hand unconsciously went to her stomach, a gesture Quinn didn't miss. "Because this time, when he beat me, he killed more than my spirit." Tears filled her eyes. "I was with child, 2 months along. The bleeding started that night. By morning, I knew the baby was gone." Quinn's sharp intake of breath cut through the evening quiet. Josephine couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see pity in his eyes. "That's when I knew," she continued, "that if I stayed, he would eventually kill me too. So I waited until he passed out, took what little money I could find, and ran." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "I lost my shoes crossing a creek. The money fell out somewhere along the way. By the time you found me, I had nothing left." A heavy silence fell between them. Josephine felt both lighter and more vulnerable for having shared her story. Quinn had not moved, had barely seemed to breathe as she spoke. Finally, he set his cup down on the bench between them and reached for her hand. His touch was tentative, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his calloused fingers closed gently around hers. "You have courage," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "more courage than most men I've known." Josephine looked up at him in surprise. It was perhaps the longest sentence he had spoken to her, and the last thing she had expected to hear. "I ran," she whispered. "How is that courage?" "Sometimes running is the bravest thing you can do," Quinn replied. "Sometimes staying is just a slow way of dying." His words struck her like a physical blow. Josephine had spent 3 years believing herself a coward for not standing up to Harold, for not fighting back. She had never considered that survival itself might require a different kind of courage. Quinn's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. "Your husband," he said, the word dripping with contempt, "is the coward. Only a coward raises his hand against someone who trusts him." Josephine found herself leaning toward Quinn, drawn by the quiet conviction in his voice. "I keep thinking he'll come looking for me." "Let him try," Quinn said, his tone shifting to something harder, more dangerous. "He won't find you unless you want to be found." The protective edge in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through Josephine's chest. For the first time since fleeing, she truly believed she might be safe. They sat in silence as darkness fell, their coffee growing cold, their hands still entwined. When the first stars appeared, Quinn finally spoke again. "I was married once," he said quietly, as if sharing a secret with the night itself. Josephine turned to him in surprise. "You were?" He nodded, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. "Her name was Sarah. We were young. I had just returned from the war, still carrying it with me in ways I didn't understand." He sighed deeply. "She tried to help. God knows she tried. But some wounds don't heal clean." "What happened?" Josephine asked gently. "Influenza took her. Winter of '71. I wasn't there, was driving cattle to Kansas City." His voice grew tight. "By the time I got back, she was already in the ground." "Quinn, I'm so sorry." He shrugged, a gesture that failed to mask his pain. "After that, I couldn't stay in Texas. Too many memories. So I drifted west, took odd jobs on ranches, finally settled here. Land was cheap and nobody asks questions out here. Josephine squeezed his hand. "Thank you for telling me." Quinn looked down at their joined hands, seeming almost surprised to find them still connected. "Guess we've both been carrying ghosts." That night, something shifted between them. As they returned to the cabin, Quinn's hand at the small of her back, Josephine felt a new understanding binding them together, two wounded souls who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. The next morning, Quinn announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. "We're running low on flour and coffee," he explained as he saddled his chestnut stallion Thunder, "and I thought you might want some things of your own, proper clothes maybe." Josephine, who had been wearing Quinn's oversized shirts knotted at the waist over her increasingly ragged dress, flushed with gratitude. "That's very kind, but I have no money to repay you." Quinn waved away her concern. "I've been saving for nothing in particular. Might as well put it to good use." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you'd rather come with me? Town's a half-day ride, but your feet seem better." The thought of venturing into town, of potentially being seen by someone who might recognize her, sent a spike of anxiety through Josephine. "I think I'll stay, if that's all right. I could tend the garden while you're gone." Quinn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be back by nightfall. There's a rifle above the door if you need it." After he rode away, the cabin felt strangely empty. Josephine had grown accustomed to Quinn's quiet presence, the sound of his movements, the way he filled a space without dominating it. Without him, the silence was less comfortable. To distract herself, she set about weeding the small garden, careful not to put too much weight on her healing feet. The work was soothing, connecting her to the earth in a way she had missed during her time in the mining town. As she worked, Josephine allowed herself to contemplate her situation. She couldn't stay with Quinn forever, imposing on his solitude and generosity. Yet the thought of leaving filled her with a surprising sadness. In just over a week, this cabin in the desert had begun to feel like more of a home than anywhere she'd lived in years. And then there was Quinn himself, reserved but kind, carrying his own sorrows, yet willing to ease hers. Josephine found her thoughts returning to him throughout the day, the strength in his hands when he changed her bandages, the rare smile that transformed his serious face, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words mattered. By late afternoon, she had finished in the garden and prepared a simple meal from the provisions Quinn had left. As the sun began its descent, Josephine stepped outside, shading her eyes to scan the horizon for any sign of the cowboy's return. When she spotted a cloud of dust in the distance, relief washed through her. But as the rider drew closer, dread replaced relief. It wasn't Quinn's broad-shouldered silhouette atop Thunder. This rider was leaner, his horse a pale buckskin instead of Quinn's chestnut stallion. Josephine backed toward the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had Harold somehow found her? Was this one of his mining friends sent to drag her back? She reached the cabin and slipped inside, grabbing the rifle from above the door with trembling hands. She had never fired a gun before, but Quinn had shown her how to load it just in case. Now she fumbled with the weapon, praying she was doing it correctly. A voice called out from outside. "Hello, the cabin. Anyone home?" It wasn't Harold's voice. Josephine peered through the window. The rider had stopped a respectful distance from the cabin, his hands visible and away from his weapons. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 20s, with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest. "I'm looking for Quinn Hayes," the young man called. "Sheriff sent me to fetch him. There's trouble in town." Josephine hesitated, unsure whether to reveal herself to this stranger. Finally, keeping the rifle at her side, she opened the door a crack. "Mr. Hayes isn't here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He rode into town this morning for supplies." The deputy's eyebrows shot up in surprise at her appearance. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "didn't know Quinn had company." "I'm a friend," Josephine said vaguely. "What kind of trouble?" "A man came into town asking questions. Big fella, mean-looking. Says his wife ran off and he's tracking her." The deputy's eyes narrowed slightly. "Says she might be injured with cuts on her feet. Sheriff thought it sounded strange, especially when the man got agitated when questioned further." Josephine's blood turned to ice. Harold. It had to be, but how had he tracked her this far? The deputy must have noticed her reaction. "Madam, you all right?" "Yes," she lied. "Just concerned about the trouble in town. When did this man arrive?" "Couple hours ago. He's been drinking at the saloon, getting louder by the minute." The deputy shifted in his saddle. "Sheriff knows Quinn sometimes helps folks in need. Thought he might know something about this missing woman." Josephine's mind raced. If Harold was in town, he might encounter Quinn. What would happen then? Would Quinn reveal her whereabouts? Would there be violence? "I'll tell Mr. Hayes when he returns," she said, already backing into the cabin. "Thank you for the message." The deputy tipped his hat again, looking uncertain. "Madam, if you're in some kind of trouble—" "No trouble," Josephine insisted. "Good day, deputy." She closed the door before he could respond, leaning against it as she listened to his horse trot away. Fear clawed at her throat. Harold was looking for her. He was in the same town as Quinn right now. Josephine paced the small cabin, the rifle still clutched in her hands. She had to warn Quinn somehow, had to prevent a confrontation between the two men. Harold was larger, with fists hardened by years of mining work and bar fights. But there was something about Quinn, a quiet strength, a precision to his movements that suggested he was no stranger to violence either. The thought of either man being hurt because of her was unbearable, especially Quinn, who had shown her nothing but kindness. As the minutes crawled by, Josephine made a decision. She couldn't wait for Quinn to return and potentially lead Harold back to the cabin. She needed to leave, to draw Harold away before he found this place, this sanctuary that had begun to heal both her body and her spirit. With shaking hands, she gathered her few possessions, the tattered dress she'd arrived in, now washed and mended, and a spare bandage for her feet. She scrawled a note to Quinn, explaining her departure and thanking him for his kindness. Then she slipped out to the corral where Mercy grazed peacefully. "I'm sorry, girl," Josephine whispered, stroking the gray mare's nose. "I wouldn't take you if I had any other choice." She had watched Quinn saddle the horses enough times to understand the basics. Mercy stood patiently as Josephine fumbled with the straps and buckles, finally securing the saddle. Leading the horse to a large rock, Josephine used it as a mounting block, wincing as she swung her still tender feet into the stirrups. Just as she turned Mercy toward the south away from town and, she hoped, away from Harold's pursuit, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. For a moment, hope surged in her chest, Quinn returning early. But as the rider came into view, her hope withered. It was Harold. He rode a borrowed horse, his massive frame making the animal look small beneath him. His face, always ruddy, was flushed with alcohol and rage. Behind him, to Josephine's horror, rode the young deputy, his expression conflicted. "There she is!" Harold bellowed, spurring his horse forward. "Josephine, you ungrateful whore!" Josephine froze, terror rooting her to the spot. How had they found her so quickly? Had the deputy suspected something when he'd seen her at the cabin? Harold reined his horse to a stop a few yards away, his small eyes burning with malice. "Did you think you could run from me? Did you think I wouldn't find you?" The deputy hung back, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Bentley, you said you just wanted to talk to your wife." Harold ignored him, his gaze fixed on Josephine. "Get down off that horse and get over here, now." Josephine's hands tightened on the reins. "No, Harold. I'm not coming back." "Like hell you're not," Harold growled, dismounting. "You're my wife. You belong to me." He started toward her. His massive hands balled into fists. The deputy moved his horse between them. "Sir, I can't let you threaten the lady." Harold turned his rage on the young man. "Stay out of this, boy. This is between me and my wife." "Please," Josephine said to the deputy. "He'll kill me if you let him take me." Harold lunged forward, grabbing for Mercy's bridle. The mare shied away, nearly unseating Josephine. "You're coming home," Harold roared, "after I teach you what happens to wives who disobey their husbands." The sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the air like thunder. "Step away from her." Quinn stood at the edge of the clearing, thunder snorting behind him, the rifle in his hands pointed squarely at Harold's chest. His face was a mask of cold fury. Harold turned slowly, sizing up this new threat. "Who the hell are you?" "The man telling you to step away," Quinn replied, his voice dangerously quiet. The deputy shifted nervously. "Mr. Hayes, there's no need for weapons. This is a domestic matter." "There's nothing domestic about a man who beats his wife," Quinn cut in, his gaze never leaving Harold. "Now step away from her, or I'll put a hole through you right here." Harold's face contorted with rage. "This is none of your business, cowboy. That's my wife you're harboring." "Not anymore," Josephine said, finding her voice at last. "I'm leaving you, Harold, for good." Harold's eyes darted between Josephine and Quinn, a new understanding dawning in their small, hateful depths. "So that's how it is? You ran off to spread your legs for the first man who'd have you?" Quinn's finger tightened on the trigger. "One more word like that, and it'll be your last." The deputy finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Bentley, I think it's best if you come back to town with me." Harold ignored him, his focus entirely on Quinn. "You want her? Fine. But know what you're getting: a deceitful, barren whore who can't even give a man a child." The words struck Josephine like a physical blow. She swayed in the saddle, bile rising in her throat. Quinn's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened further. "Deputy, I suggest you take Mr. Bentley back to town, now, before this ends badly for him." The deputy nodded, finally understanding. "Mr. Bentley, please mount your horse. We're leaving." For a tense moment, it seemed Harold might refuse. He stood his ground, glaring at Quinn with naked hatred. Then, abruptly, he spat on the ground and turned away. "This isn't over," he warned as he climbed onto his horse. "A man has rights to his wife." "Not this one," Quinn replied evenly. "Not anymore." The deputy gestured for Harold to ride ahead of him, then tipped his hat apologetically to Quinn and Josephine before following. As they disappeared into the distance, Josephine felt the strength drain from her body. She slumped forward in the saddle, trembling uncontrollably. Quinn was at her side in an instant, helping her down from Mercy's back. His arms went around her as her knees gave way, and she found herself pressed against his chest, his heart thundering beneath her ear. "I thought you were gone," he murmured into her hair. "I came back and found your note." "I couldn't let him find you because of me," Josephine whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't bear it if he hurt you." Quinn pulled back slightly to look at her, his hazel eyes intense. "Josephine, listen to me. That man will never touch you again, not while I draw breath." The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed her despite her fear. "How did you know about Harold?" Quinn led her toward the cabin, his arms still around her waist. "I was in the general store when he rode into town, asking about a woman matching your description. Said his wife had run off, that she was confused, needed medical attention." His jaw tightened. "I knew immediately who he was looking for." "What did you do?" "Left my supplies and rode straight back here. I was afraid he might have already found you." Quinn's hand tightened on her waist. "I shouldn't have left you alone." "It's not your fault," Josephine assured him as they entered the cabin. "You couldn't have known he'd track me here." Quinn helped her to a chair, then knelt before her, examining her feet to ensure her ride hadn't reopened any wounds. "He won't stop, you know. Men like him don't." Josephine nodded, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. "What am I going to do? Where can I go that he won't find me?" Quinn was silent for a long moment, his fingers gentle as they rewrapped her bandages. When he finally spoke, his voice was hesitant, almost shy. "You could stay here. With me." Josephine stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" Quinn straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "Stay here. I'll protect you. Harold Bentley will never lay a hand on you again." "Quinn, I can't ask that of you. You've already done so much." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncertain. "I know it hasn't been long. I know you might not feel, but I've grown fond of having you here. The cabin feels like a home again with you in it. Josephine's heart fluttered in her chest. "Quinn, what are you saying?" He took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. "I'm saying I care for you, Josephine. More than I should, perhaps, given how short a time we've known each other. But these past days with you have been the happiest I've had in years." Tears sprang to Josephine's eyes. "Oh, Quinn." "I'm not asking for anything," he hurried to add. "Just stay. Let me keep you safe. The rest can wait until you're ready." "If you ever are." Josephine looked around the small cabin that had become her sanctuary, then back at the man kneeling before her, this quiet cowboy who had saved her life in more ways than one. Something bloomed in her chest, warm and bright as the desert sunrise. "I've spent 3 years with a man who made me feel worthless," she said softly. "In just over a week, you've made me feel valued, seen." She squeezed his hands. "I'll stay, Quinn, for as long as you'll have me." The smile that spread across Quinn's face transformed him, erasing years of solitude and grief. "Then it seems we both found something we weren't looking for." That night, Harold Bentley returned to the cabin, as Quinn had predicted he might. But this time, Quinn was waiting. When Harold's drunken shouts roused them from sleep, Quinn met him outside with his rifle. No shots were fired, no blood was shed. But when Quinn returned to the cabin an hour later, his knuckles bruised and his expression grim but satisfied, Josephine knew Harold would not trouble them again. "He's gone," Quinn said simply, "and he knows what will happen if he ever comes back." Josephine didn't ask for details. Instead, she tended to Quinn's hands, her touch conveying the gratitude she couldn't express in words. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a new rhythm together. Quinn taught Josephine to ride properly, to shoot the rifle, to track game through the desert. She expanded the garden, learned to cook over the open fire, and read aloud to him in the evenings as he whittled or mended tack. Their relationship evolved slowly, respectfully. Quinn never presumed, never pushed. He slept on his pallet by the stove while Josephine took the bed, maintaining a proper distance even as the connection between them deepened. It was Josephine who finally bridged that distance. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars emerge, she leaned over and kissed his cheek, a soft, tentative touch that nevertheless sent heat rushing through both of them. Quinn turned to her, surprise and hope warring in his expression. "Josephine, I'm ready," she whispered, "if you still want me." His answer was to draw her into his arms, his lips finding hers with a tenderness that made her heart soar. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of their embrace. That night, Quinn Hayes did not sleep on his pallet by the stove. Summer gave way to fall, and fall to winter. Quinn expanded the cabin, adding a second room and reinforcing the walls against the desert cold. Josephine planted fruit trees that wouldn't bear for years, a promise to the future. In the spring of 1879, they rode together into Redemption, the nearest town, to speak with the local judge. Harold Bentley had never filed for divorce, likely assuming Josephine would return or perish in the desert. The judge, hearing the full story and seeing the scars that still marked Josephine's feet, granted the divorce in absentia, freeing her at last from her marriage to Harold. That same day, with wildflowers in her hair and joy in her heart, Josephine Parker became Josephine Hayes, wed to Quinn by the same judge in a simple ceremony with the deputy, now a friend as witness. Their ride home was leisurely, both savoring their new status as husband and wife. As the cabin came into view, Josephine reined Mercy to a halt, overcome suddenly by the journey that had brought her here from desperate flight to profound love. "What is it?" Quinn asked, stopping Thunder beside her. Josephine gazed at the cabin, at the garden now lush with spring growth, at the corrals Quinn had expanded, at the new addition with its fresh-cut timber gleaming in the sunlight. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "about that day you found me in the desert, how close I came to dying there, how you brought me water and bandaged my feet without saying a word." Quinn reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "Best thing I ever did," he said simply. Josephine smiled through happy tears. I never believed I could be this happy again, that I could trust a man again, that I could love again. I'll spend every day making sure you never regret that trust, Quinn promised, raising her hand to his lips. They rode the rest of the way home together, hand in hand, the desert blooming around them, a symbol of resilience, of life, finding a way even in the harshest conditions. 2 years later, the Hayes cabin was filled with the cries of a newborn baby girl, delivered safely with the help of a midwife from Redemption. Quinn paced outside during the birth, terrified of losing Josephine as he had lost Sarah. But when the midwife placed his daughter in his arms, a tiny, perfect being with her mother's delicate features and his hazel eyes, he wept with joy. Sarah, Josephine suggested from the bed, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. We could name her Sarah. Quinn looked at his wife in wonder, humbled by her generosity of spirit. Are you sure? Josephine nodded. Your first wife deserves to be remembered, and perhaps, with time, the name will bring you joy instead of sorrow. Quinn carried their daughter to the bed, settling carefully beside Josephine. Sarah Josephine Hayes, he said, testing the name. It's perfect, just like her mother. As twilight fell over the desert, the little family remained together in the warm glow of the lamp, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western sky. Outside, the desert bloomed with unexpected life, much like the love that had flourished between a woman who had escaped with bruises and bare feet and the cowboy who had brought water and bandages without a word. In the years that followed, the Hayes family prospered. Quinn's skill with horses drew buyers from as far away as California, and the ranch expanded to include a dozen fine mares and a prize stallion. Josephine's garden grew into a proper farm, providing not only for their family, but producing enough surplus to sell in town. Sarah grew into a spirited child with her father's quiet strength and her mother's compassionate heart. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, James, and then 3 years after that by twins, Elizabeth and Benjamin. The cabin expanded again and again to accommodate their growing family, eventually becoming a proper ranch house with a wide porch where Quinn and Josephine would sit in the evenings watching their children play in the yard as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the children were asleep, Josephine would trace the thin scars on her feet, permanent reminders of her desperate flight across the desert, and Quinn would take her feet in his hands, pressing gentle kisses to those scars, wordlessly reaffirming the promise he had made on that first day, to heal her, to protect her, to love her. Their love story, born of desperation and kindness, became something of a legend in the territory. People would point to the Hayes Ranch as they rode past, telling their children in hushed tones about the brave woman who had fled a monster and the quiet cowboy who had saved her with nothing more than water, bandages, and an open heart. And in the evenings, when Quinn would pull out his guitar and play softly by the fire, Josephine would sometimes sing something she had not done since before her first marriage. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now filled their home with joy, a testament to the healing power of true love. I never thought I'd sing again, she confessed to Quinn one night as they lay together, the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. I'm glad you found your voice, he murmured, drawing her closer. It's as beautiful as you are. Josephine rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. You gave me more than safety, Quinn. You gave me myself back. He kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. And you gave me a reason to live again after I thought that part of me had died with Sarah. Together, they had rebuilt each other from the broken pieces of their past, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either could have imagined. Their love, forged in the crucible of pain and healing, had transformed not only their own lives, but the lives of their children and the very land around them. The desert that had once nearly claimed Josephine's life now sustained their family, yielding its bounty to their careful stewardship. The cabin that had been Quinn's lonely refuge now rang with laughter and love, and two wounded hearts, once resigned to solitude and suffering, now beat as one, whole and healed at last. In the end, it was not just a love story between a woman and a man, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to its capacity to overcome trauma, to trust again, to find beauty even in the most barren places. And it had all begun with a desperate escape, with bruises and bare feet, with a cowboy who brought water and bandages without a word, but with a heart open to the possibility of love when he least expected to find it.